A nome di Comitato Festival Letteratura ringraziamo il gruppo TEA per aver contribuito alla realizzazione di questo evento. A mettere gli accenti al posto giusto, Marta Bacigalupo e Luca Pareschi.
Buongiorno a tutti, bentrovati per il primo accento in lingua di questa giornata. Circa 2 anni fa, Jan Carson ha deciso di trascorrere 365 giorni in compagnia di Agatha Christie.
So about 3 years ago, Jan Carson decided to stay 365 days together with Agatha Christie.
Nella prossima mezz'ora temo non riuscirà a parlarci di tutti e 66 i suoi libri, ma sicuramente riuscirà a farci innamorare della regina del giallo. Carson and Christie, l'accento di Jan Carson, inizia ora.
So I'm stealing 10 seconds, so probably in the next 30 minutes she will not have the time to speak about the 66th book, but I'm sure that she will have the chance to get us fully in love with Agatha Christie. There we go.
Okay, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. My name is Jan. I am from East Belfast. I don't know if anyone here has been to Belfast before, but we have quite a strange accent there, so I'm going to try and speak slowly for the next 30 minutes, which will be difficult because I'm going to talk about probably my favourite thing to talk about in the entire world. I'm a novelist myself, and I usually get invited to book festivals to talk about me. And it is a delight today to talk about something a bit more interesting than myself for a change. I'm going to be talking about Dame Agatha Christie, who lived from 1890 to 1976. She died whenever she was 86, and she contributed an enormous amount of books to different genres. As mentioned in the introduction, I am not an Agatha Christie expert. I don't have a degree in this. What I do have is a tremendous love for Agatha's books, and I wanted to begin by asking, could you raise your hand if you've read an Agatha Christie novel? Okay. Hello, dear friends. I feel like I'm in good company. Anybody brave enough to say that they've never read an Agatha Christie before? Wow. Oh, we've got one chap at the back. You are in for a treat. I'm actually quite jealous of you. You've got a lifetime ahead of you of good books. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give you 10 facts about Agatha Christie that you might never have heard of before. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own relationship with Agatha Christie, how she shaped my life and my work. And then if we've got time at the end, I'll give you some tips on books to get started. And I love that you've got your notebook out already. And I would really recommend getting something out to scribble down. I've also prepared a stunning PowerPoint, which may or may not work. So hopefully there'll be some little illustrations popping up. So let's begin with 10 facts about Christie. I've got a clicker here, so I'm hoping this will work. Yes! Okay. Probably that means I should talk slower and louder. So, first of all, Christie was incredibly prolific. After the Bible and Shakespeare, her work is supposed to be the most widely published in the world. It's quite hard to argue with God, and I don't know if she's going to take down Shakespeare anytime soon. She's been translated into over 100 languages, with more than 2 billion books sold worldwide, including 300 million in her own lifetime. And yet, when I read her biography there a few weeks ago, she actually struggled with paying her taxes at one point. So it just shows you that you can be an incredibly successful author and the tax man can still catch up with you and take your fortune away. So Christie, an incredibly prolific author. Secondly, and this is Christie as a young girl, she didn't have a particularly traditional route to writing. So I didn't either. When people ask me, have you always wanted to be a writer? I usually say no, I wanted to be a football commentator when I was younger. I couldn't understand the offside rule, so that has never happened, and I became a writer instead. Christie was similar. Although her brother and sister were sent away to school, and her mother was sent to finishing schools in France, her mum, for some reason, didn't want her to read. I don't know why, but Agatha Christie taught herself to read at 5 years old, and she educated herself reading from her dad's library. It was a remarkable beginning for such a successful career. She actually fell into writing detective stories as a bit of a bet. Her big sister Madge bet her that she couldn't write a detective story, and always being up for a challenge, Agatha took that on, and she wrote her first character based on a Belgian refugee that she saw in Torquay. And of course, we know that that first person was Hercule Poirot, who would go on to be one of her most famous detectives. The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which was her first novel, was rejected 6 times before it was published in 1920, so almost 200 years ago. Going on from that, Christie invented 2 of the world's most beloved detectives. And let's have a quick poll. Hands up if you're a Poirot fan. Hands up if you're a Miss Marple fan. More Marples than Poirots. That's a first. I will confess that I am a Poirot woman. I have been in love with Hercule since I first came across him. Both Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple are creations of Christie's imagination, though they were based on different people she encountered in her life. The detectives appear in multiple books, and they've been portrayed on screen by many, many different actors, and I've created some of them up here for you. You can see Charles Laughton, David Suchet, who is my Poirot. A few nods in the audience. Yes, I actually bumped into him once in London, and I nearly died of pleasure. We couldn't get anything out to say to him. Peter Ustinov and Kenneth Branagh. That moustache. And we also have some marbles up here. Joan Hickson, my marble. Anyone else? We've got Angela Lansbury, Helen Mays, and a few others up there. She also invented the sleuthing husband and wife duo, Tommy and Tuppence, and less said the better about the pair of them. They are a good example of how even brilliant authors like Agatha Christie sometimes get it a wee bit wrong. Posthumous publications. As I mentioned, Christie had a really long publishing career, over 5 decades, but by the late 1930s, about 2 decades into writing Poirot, she'd begun to get a bit bored with him. Similarly, Arthur Conan Doyle also got really bored of Sherlock Holmes and tried to kill him off. Unfortunately, the reading public absolutely loved Poirot and wouldn't let Christie kill him off. So in 1940, she penned Curtain, which is the final Poirot story, and asked that it would be held until later in her career and published after she died. It actually wasn't published after she died, it was published just before she died. The final Miss Marple, which is Sleeping Murder, a really good Miss Marple, was the final book that was published by Christie just a few months after she passed away in 1976. Hercule Poirot, when he died, did receive an obituary in the New York Times, and I think he is the only fictional character ever to have had a proper obituary. When David Suchet died in the ITV3 series a few years back in Curtain, I had a wake at my house, and we lit candles to his memory, and I still get a bit teary-eyed when it comes on repeat. Something else you might not know about Christie, she had war service both in the First World War and in the Second World War at the height of her career. During the First World War, she worked in a hospital in Devon as both a nurse and apothecary's assistant. Years later, she contributed to the Second World War by working as a pharmacy assistant in University College Hospital in London. She also let her home in Devon be used to station troops during the Second World War, and there are still some of the murals they painted of semi-naked women up on the walls there if you get a chance to see them. Christie, when she worked in the pharmacy and the apothecary, got an incredible knowledge of drugs, particularly poisons, and if you've read any Christie novels, you'll know that her weapon of choice was poison. Man, oh man, did she love arsenic. You really wouldn't want to have been sat beside her at a dinner party. So you can see her history of how she understood poisons, and if you want to know a little bit more, there's a brilliant book called A is for Arsenic by Catherine Harkup, which looks at the poisons of Christie and came out last year. This one you may not know. You will probably know that Christie was a consummate traveller. Her first husband, Archie Christie, had a job promoting the British Empire exhibition and took her on a round-the-world trip. And here you can see Christie, if you squint really quickly, on a surfboard. She became really good at bodyboarding, apparently, whenever she was in South Africa and New Zealand. And then, and I love this fact, when she was in Hawaii, she didn't like the fact that it was only men who got to stand up on the boards, and she's reported to be one of the first Western women to stand up on a surfboard, which I think is one of the most interesting, cool facts about Agatha Christie. Tells you a lot about her personality as well. Of course, her second husband, Max Malloyan, was a famous archaeologist, and we'll talk a little bit more about her travels with him in a second. Her husband was suspected of murdering her, and here comes probably the most famous escapade in Christie's life. 1926 saw both highlights and heartache for Christie. She'd become a household name with the publication of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is widely thought to be one of her best books, and anybody who reveals the solution will not get out of here alive because it's very devious. She also lost her mother that year, and her husband Archie revealed that he'd been having an affair with a younger woman, his golfing partner Nancy Neal. The result of this was an 11-day period where no one's quite sure what happened. Christie disappeared from her house outside London. Her car was found crashed into a tree, and nobody knew where she was for 11 days. There was all sorts of consternation. The newspapers put out these, you may see Agatha Christie in disguise pictures. Dorothy L. Sayers, the crime writer, started a hunt to try and find her alongside lots of members of the public. Arthur Conan Doyle consulted a medium to see if the spirit world could tell him where Agatha Christie had gotten to. And eventually she turned up in a spa hotel in Harrogate in Yorkshire, claiming that she had an amnesia and that she couldn't remember where she'd been for the last 11 days. There's still a lot of speculation over what happened to Christie in those 11 days. If you watch the 1979 film Agatha, which I'd recommend, it's got Vanessa Redgrave and Dustin Hoffman in it. It's a really interesting fictional account of those 11 days. People speculated whether she'd committed suicide, whether Archie had killed her, whether this was an attention-seeking manoeuvre, what was going on, and we still don't really know. The new Lucy Worsley biography, A Very Elusive Woman, which came out yesterday, is probably the best full account of those 11 days that you'll get so far, and I would thoroughly recommend it. It's a brilliant, brilliant biography. She was also interested in archaeology and photography. After divorcing Archie Christie, she married her second husband, a much younger man called Max Malloyan. They actually manipulated their ages whenever they were getting married. I think there was about a 14-year age gap, and it came down to about 7 or 8 by the time it was released to the press. Max Malloyan is an interesting character. He's not as handsome as Archie was, for sure, but they met on a dig, an archaeological dig, and their interests were very similar. For the rest of her life, Christie followed him to different places around the world, digs in Syria and Iraq. She photographed some of the finds from these exhibitions, and there are actually, if you go to the British Museum, there are some pottery shards that Christie herself discovered. And I love this fact. She tried to clean them up with her face cream, apparently, and removed some of the layers off. So the British Museum aren't particularly happy about that, but they are there. You can see the influence of these travels in her work. So if you've read Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, even Murder on the Orient Express, there are elements of her as a world traveller in there. And it's my dream to get a wee trip on the Orient Express at some stage to try and follow in her footsteps. There's some speculation as well that she actually funded a lot of Max Malloyan's career. So there are some anonymous checks that kept his archaeology practice going. I don't think sometimes I think he's more of a shady character than we think. Her final years. So Christie lived to a great old age. She was 86 when she passed away, and this is actually my area of expertise. I have a specialism in looking at dementia and contemporary fiction. And most scholars now think that Christie probably had dementia for the last period of her writing. We know that because there's been studies done into the range of words that she used. So the University in Toronto studied a selection of Christie's later work, and they can see that her vocabulary goes down very quickly. She begins to use very indefinite words like thing and something and anything a lot more. And a lot of her final books, they're quite hard to follow. Has anyone read Postern of Fate? Yeah, I don't actually know what it's about. It's a very odd book. So a few of the later stage ones in the 70s feel quite jumbled, but we have to consider she was a woman in her 80s at this point who'd written dozens and dozens of books and travelled and had a huge life. And my final one, I love this picture. Christie holds quite a few different records for different things, for her prolificness and all sorts of things. This is my favourite Guinness World Record that she holds. This is the thickest book in the world. I'm going to endeavour to do that at some stage. It comes in at 4,032 pages. I don't actually know how you'd read it. You'd have to get pillows and prop it up in bed. But this is the complete works of Miss Marple, which was published and still holds the Guinness World Record for the largest book in the world. Okay, those are my wee facts about Agatha Christie. I don't know if they said at the start because I don't speak Italian, but I'm going to be around all weekend, and if you want to come and chat to me more about Agatha Christie, I am more than happy to meet Agatha Christie fans. I'm going to finish up by reading a wee paper that I wrote just after the 2020, after I'd finished reading all of the novels consecutively, and it talks a little about my own relationship with Agatha Christie. Here I am, with sadly not the real David Suchet, because I was too chicken to ask for a photograph, but this is David Suchet's biography of playing Poirot. Suchet played Poirot for longer than he wasn't Poirot, so he started playing him when he was 30 and finished when he was about 63. So imagine being a fictional character for longer than you were yourself. I just think that's fascinating. So, yeah, we're doing good for time. When I'm asked which writers have influenced me, I usually say Flannery O'Connor and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. As a lapsed Presbyterian magic realist, I'm the love child this pair would never have had. The truth is, I came relatively late to those books you're supposed to read. And if I'm being entirely honest, the writer who has influenced me most is the late, great Agatha Christie. I've been modelling myself on her for years. I first encountered Christie at the unlikely age of 8. Having devoured all the books in the children's section of Ballymena Library, I wandered into crime and picked up Murder in the Clouds. It was clever, vicious, and most importantly, not meant for children. I was instantly hooked. Overnight, I transitioned from Nancy Drew, who dabbled in robberies and the odd kidnapping, to Agatha Christie, who loved to murder liberally. 6 months later, I read And Then There Were None. It gave me nightmares. This was much of the draw. Agatha Christie was my gateway drug to Sherlock Holmes and Bram Stoker, Emily Bronte and Stephen King, Goodbye Anne of Green Gables and Enid Blyton's Jolly Japes. I was on a slippery slope. My parents never curtailed my reading, unsuitable though it might have been. I think my dad was actually glad that I'd discovered crime. Dad was a Christie fan himself. We soon fell into the habit of watching the adaptations together. My dad passed away in 2021, and Christmas felt a bit odd last year without watching and dissecting a Poirot or two together. We never minded watching repeats. Poirot was just the excuse we used to spend a few hours together sharing something that we loved. I still think of my dad every time I watch Christie on the big or small screen. Agatha Christie is an unbroken theme running throughout my life. As a child, I loved the language of her books and frequently paused my reading to look up new words she'd taught me in the family dictionary. Unscrupulous, macabre, arsenic. Nobody talked like this in Ballymena, the provincial market town where I grew up. I filed these words away for later use. Christie kept me company as a teenager when I spent long stretches in hospital, unable to concentrate on anything but her novels. Later, we travelled around the world together. Her paperbacks were often tucked into my rucksack pocket and devoured on trains and airplanes. 15 years ago, when I started writing seriously, I reread her biography and found there a blueprint for the kind of writer I wanted to be. A huge part of writing is coming to terms with the kind of writer that you actually are. Early on, I realised that, as in life, I was never going to be the less is more type. I write a lot. I overwrite. I always have too many ideas. I seethe with jealousy when I encounter those careful, slow writers who take a decade over a book. They seem serious and earnest, whilst I feel slapdash and over-eager, like a little kid showing off. I'm often embarrassed by my creative output. This peaked during lockdown, when others, quite understandably, struggled to write, whilst I used productivity as a coping mechanism, writing enormous amounts of mostly drivel. It wasn't the healthiest way to navigate a pandemic, but it beat heavy drinking and heroin. I didn't know how else to cope. Agatha Christie's always made me feel better about being the kind of writer that I am. She was the definition of prolific. Her writing career spanned 6 decades and included 66 crime novels, 14 story collections and umpteen plays, including The Mousetrap, the world's longest-running production of a play. In 1934 alone, she published 5 entire novels. Her imagination outpaced her prodigious writing abilities. The dozens of notebooks she left behind, lovingly collated by Jan Carson, reveal many undeveloped ideas such as the tantalising legless man, sometimes tall, sometimes short, proof perhaps that Agatha Christie was a closet magic realist. Christie played a long game with her writing, constantly learning and developing. Her work peaks mid-career, but even in her late 70s, she was still astounding readers with her quick wit and clever plotting. Her popularity remained undiminished almost 45 years after her death, with something between 2 and 4 billion books sold in 100 languages. She is amongst the world's most successful authors. Agatha Christie proves there's not one way to be a writer. She read Graham Greene and Muriel Spark and a host of other contemporaries and championed their writing, though it was wildly different from hers. She wrote the stories that she could write, and she wrote a lot of them. Some writers have 1 book in them, others have 100 or more. I suspect that I'll fall somewhere in between what Agatha Christie's taught me. Agatha Christie has taught me that comparison does not serve the writer well. Christie's influence remains enormous, and yet she took a remarkably pragmatic attitude to her writing. She's always honest and objective about her work and quick to be her own critic. She was not happy with how The Mystery of the Blue Train turned out, and in a letter to a friend summed up that her latest offering was not as good as Roger Ackroyd, but not too bad. She never glamorized the role of the writer. Repeatedly in her autobiography, she talks about writing as something done to pay the bills. She was notably shy of the PR circus, which pursued her as she became something of a celebrity. 20 novels in, she actually introduced a fictional lady novelist named Ariadne Oliver and used this character to lambast herself. In Dead Man's Folly, Miss Oliver echoes Christie's own views on the subject. I mean, what can you say about how you write your books? What I mean is, first you've got to think of something, and then when you've thought of it, you've got to force yourself to sit down and write it. That's all. I sometimes wonder what Agatha Christie would make of the current literary world, where writers often do more talking about how they write than actual writing. I don't think she'd have had much time for it. And yet I believe Christie revelled in the act of writing and took due pleasure in what she wrote. Upon receiving positive reviews of her masterpiece, the now titled And Then There Were None, she wrote, "The person who was really pleased with it was myself, for I knew better than any critic how difficult it had been." I suspect Agatha Christie understood the difference between being a writer and actually writing, and placed proper emphasis on the latter act. I would do well to remember this on the weeks when the public role of writer keeps me away from my writing desk. Finally, and perhaps a little strangely, for though she dabbles with the occult in novels like Dumb Witness and The Pale Horse, she was exclusively a realist. I love Agatha Christie because I am a magic realist. As a writer of magical realism, I'm constantly attempting to upset my readers' assumptions about reality. Might I suggest that no writer questions the veracity of everyone and everything as effectively as Christie? Her typical mise en scene involves gathering the suspects in a closed room, while Poirot, or occasionally Marple, unpicks each suspect's defence in turn, proving they are not what they seem and infinitely capable of murder, regardless of whether they've actually brandished the knife or not. This deeply unsettling model, now mirrored in almost every crime drama from Broadchurch to 2019's excellent Knives Out, involves delicately maintaining the suspension of disbelief whilst the reader is forced to question everything she thinks she knows. Christie's method is sleight of hand, laying a breadcrumb trail of clues so subtly the fantastic revelation in the final act has been carefully foreshadowed from the start. The entire novel needs reimagined through the lens of this new and startling information. I'd argue that the fantastic element in a piece of magical realism works in a similarly unsettling way. I learned as much about leading my readers through strange, unsettling circumstances from Christie as I ever learned from the writer who made their names chronicling the unreal. Every time I pick up one of her novels, I feel like she teaches me something new. I'm going to finish there because we're nearly out of time, and I'm going to flick up very quickly some further reading, which I will leave up there. These are some books about Agatha Christie I'll leave for you to jot down, and I'm going to very quickly run through my top 10. So if you've never read any Christie before, these are my 10 favourites, and then I will get lost and you can talk to me after. First of all, A Murder is Announced, which I think is Miss Marple's finest hour and crammed full of classic tropes. Number 2, Five Little Pigs. Christie delivers some of her finest depictions of characters as Poirot revises a case long closed. 3, and if you're only going to read one Christie, read this one, And Then There Were None. The absolute best and a standalone. The body count is exceptionally high if you like a bit of gore in that one. Number 4, Cricket House. Proof, if needed, that Christie wasn't as cosy as people thought she was, and she was more than willing to make children be murderers. That might give away a bit of a plot there. 5, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, the first Poirot novel. 6, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, one of the best plot twists in crime fiction. 7, Why Didn't They Ask Evans, which is Christie at her high camp best. If you like Jeeves and Wooster, that's your Christie to start with. 8, Murder on the Orient Express, one of the most complicated and sophisticated solutions that she comes up with. 9, The ABC Murders, which I think it's dark and it's brilliant. And number 10, I think possibly up there with my favourite Marple, The Body in the Library, which comes across as quite cosy, but definitely isn't as cosy as you think. Thank you so much for a half hour of your time, and please come and chat to me more.
Thank you. Speriamo che questi 30 minuti in compagnia di Jen, Agatha, Jane e Hercule abbiano lasciato un segno nella vostra giornata. Torneremo a mettere l'accento sui sé della storia di Manzoni alle 11 con Alessandro Zaccuri, sempre qui in Casa Accenti.
Grazie, a più tardi.